On a snowy road deep in the Montana hills, a struggling single father with only $154 in his wallet stumbles upon a makeshift auction in the woods. What he finds there is not cattle or tools, but a barefoot 19-year-old black girl shivering silently, sold as an object no one wants to remember. He didn't have enough money. He didn't have a plan. But what he did have was a daughter at home, a memory of helplessness he would never forget, and a voice that finally said, "I'll take her." What follows is not a love story in the traditional sense, but an inspiring love story born of hardship, a powerful story of someone who chose compassion when no one else would. This heartwarming family drama is a reminder that kindness can change lives and that sometimes the most heroic thing you can do is simply not look away. If true stories of redemption and quiet courage touch your heart, stay with us, because this story may stay with you forever. The wind came hard off the ridge that afternoon, cold enough to cut through steel. The sky hung low over the Montana backwoods, heavy with clouds that looked like they might drop snow at any moment. On a narrow dirt road mostly buried in frost and silence, a weathered Chevy pickup rolled slow, its tires crunching over gravel and ice patches. Inside, Dylan Scott gripped the steering wheel a little tighter than usual. He hadn't meant to come this far north. Hell, he hadn't even planned on taking that last left turn off the state highway. But something about the hand-painted sign nailed to a broken fence, "Cash Auction 3 p.m., had pulled at something in him. It wasn't curiosity. It was older than that. He'd seen too many signs in his life that promised quick deals and darker consequences. Still, he turned off the main road anyway, steering deeper into nowhere, a dog-eared envelope of guilt and instinct sitting heavy in his chest. Dylan wasn't a reckless man. 43 years old, single father to a 7-year-old girl, he lived quiet and worked steady. He fixed tractors, delivered feed, repaired fences for folks who still called him that widower down by Miller's Creek. He didn't drink much anymore, didn't go into town unless he had to, and never went looking for trouble. So it made no sense that his boots hit the cold dirt outside that truck, the door slamming shut behind him with a final thud. He didn't know what he expected to find at the end of that trail, but it sure as hell wasn't what greeted him. A crude clearing surrounded by tall, bare pines, half a dozen old trucks parked haphazardly around a dying bonfire, and a wooden platform made of pallets and rusted nails, like someone had tried to build a stage with a hammer and no shame. There was a small crowd of men, mostly middle-aged or older, all white, some in stained hunting jackets, others with hats pulled low to hide their faces. They didn't laugh or talk much. Just stood there watching, waiting silent in a way that didn't feel peaceful. Dylan kept his hands in his pockets and his head low as he moved closer. No one greeted him. A man in a tattered trench coat stood on the platform holding a cigarette between two fingers and waving a hand at something just out of sight. His voice cracked across the cold air like a whip. 19. Quiet. Healthy enough. Works. Don't eat much. Then they brought her out. At first, Dylan wasn't sure what he was looking at. The girl, barefoot, her toes bright red from the cold jeans torn at the knees, stood on the platform like she wasn't fully awake, like her body was there, but the rest of her had already checked out. Her coat hung off one shoulder, 2 sizes too big, and her hair, dark and tangled, fell over her face in uneven waves. She didn't look at the crowd, didn't flinch, just stared somewhere behind them, like the trees were more real than the men in front of her. The man on the platform snapped his fingers once. "Don't be shy now, sweetheart. Turn around. Let him see you." She didn't move. He grabbed her arm. That's when Dylan stepped forward. Just a step, just a reflex, but it was enough to draw attention. A man near him, thick-necked and grinning, nudged the guy next to him and muttered, "Don't bother. Girl like that, she's been passed around already. Barely worth the gas it'd take to bring her home." Another voice chimed in louder this time. "I wouldn't bring her near my kids. You don't know where she's been. Besides, you know how they are. Always running. You buy her, you're buying problems." Dylan froze. Something in him twisted. It wasn't just the way they said it. It was what they didn't say. They meant something more than just strangers. They meant her skin, her silence, her history. Gina Mitchell. He didn't know her name yet, but he knew the look in her eyes had already been made small enough. These men weren't buying a worker. They were buying permission to feel bigger than someone else. The auctioneer called out again. "Starting at 100. Cash only. Let's go. She ain't gonna stand here forever." No one raised a hand. Dylan's jaw clenched. His wallet was in his back pocket. $154. That was it. Rent was paid. Truck had gas. But Abby's winter coat had a tear in it, and he still hadn't filled her inhaler prescription. He should have turned around, should have kept driving. But then the girl on the platform shifted just slightly, and he caught a glimpse of her face under the hair. Her eyes were dark, yes, but they weren't blank. Not quite. There was something buried there, something hard and tired and angry and expecting. Like she already knew no one was going to step forward, that people like her didn't get rescued, that this was just another long day on a short leash that wouldn't last much longer. That's when he heard himself speak. "I'll take her." His own voice startled him. It was loud in the stillness. A few heads turned. Someone behind him chuckled a dry, empty sound. The auctioneer squinted at him. "You serious, old man?" Dylan walked forward, slowly pulled out his wallet. "I've got $154, cash." The man spit to the side. "You're short." Dylan didn't blink, just held the bills out in his hand steady. "That's what I've got." A pause, then a shrug. "She's yours. No refunds." The girl didn't move, didn't react. Dylan didn't offer a hand. He didn't want to scare her. He just nodded toward the truck. She hesitated barely, but then stepped down from the platform. Her feet hit the frozen dirt with a soft thud. She walked past him without a word, arms wrapped tight around her ribs. Dylan waited a second, then followed. The ride back was silent. He kept the heater on full blast. She kept her eyes on the window. Her fingers were trembling. Dylan adjusted the rear-view mirror and said as gently as he could, name her voice when it came was low, rough like it hadn't been used in days. "Gina, I'm Dylan. My daughter's name is Abby. She's 7. Gina said nothing. He didn't push. Back at the cabin, dusk had settled deep in the trees. Smoke curled from the chimney. The porch light flickered once, then stayed steady. Dylan Park stepped out and opened the passenger door. Gina didn't move. "You can come in. Just warm up. Then we'll figure things out." She stepped down slowly like every muscle was sore. He opened the front door, letting her go in first. The warmth inside hit like a wall wood stove, humming the smell of old pine and cinnamon still lingering from breakfast. He pointed to the couch. "You can sleep there tonight. I'll grab a blanket." She didn't sit, just stood scanning the room like it might vanish if she blinked. Dylan returned with a quilt, held it out. She took it, but didn't wrap it around herself. Instead, she looked at him for the first time. Really looked. Why he didn't pretend not to understand. Just said because no one else was going to. She blinked once. "I don't owe you anything," she said. "No," Dylan replied. "You don't." She finally sat down, the blanket folded on her lap like a shield. He left the hallway light on, just dim enough to make the shadows feel distant. He didn't know her name an hour ago. Now, somehow, she was in his living room, trying to remember what safety felt like. Neither of them slept much that night. The cabin was quiet the next morning, wrapped in that kind of silence, only found in the middle of nowhere, where the trees swallowed sound, and the snow outside muffled everything else. Gina stirred before daylight. She hadn't really slept, not the way sleep was supposed to feel. Her body had rested, but her mind never shut off. It stayed alert, on edge, like a coiled wire. She had spent too many nights in strange places with people who made promises they never intended to keep. The couch cushions were softer than anything she was used to, and the quilt faded. Florals smelled faintly of cedar, had held a kind of warmth she hadn't trusted enough to enjoy. She sat up slowly, her bare feet resting on the wooden floor. The fire in the stove was low, but still burning. She didn't move toward it. Instead, she scanned the room in front of her, taking in the framed photo on the wall, a little girl with missing teeth and wild curls holding up a paper heart, the smudge of a tiny handprint in paint, pinned beside it, a dusty wedding picture tucked into a corner shelf. Nothing expensive, nothing new, but it all felt lived in, real. The kitchen was still and dim. A single mug sat beside the sink, the bottom stained with yesterday's coffee. Gina walked toward it, slowly testing the floorboards beneath her with each step. No creaks, no cameras, no locks. She looked toward the door, half expecting a bolt to be drawn across it overnight. There wasn't one. She turned the handle just to check. It opened, just like that. She could have left, just walked out into the cold and disappeared again. But she didn't. Her eyes moved back toward the couch, the folded blanket, the fire she hadn't started. There was something here she didn't understand yet, and that made her stay. Dylan appeared from the hallway a few minutes later, wearing a flannel shirt over a white undershirt, boots, already laced hair damp like he'd just washed up. He paused when he saw her standing in the middle of the kitchen like she didn't know where she was allowed to be. He didn't smile, didn't frown either, just gave a small nod and reached for the kettle. "There's towels in the hallway closet," he said, not looking directly at her. "If you want to shower." Gina didn't answer right away. Her throat was dry and her voice came out more brittle than she expected. "You're not going to ask me anything." He poured water into the kettle, lit the burner, and waited a beat before answering. "Would it help if I did?" She looked down at the floor, arms crossed. "No." He nodded, not smug, not judging, just accepting. That was new. Steam started rising from the kettle. He reached into the cabinet, grabbed a second mug, and placed it gently on the counter next to hers. "Coffee." She nodded once. He filled both mugs black, no sugar. She took hers with both hands, the ceramic warm against her fingers. They stood in silence for a few minutes, not the kind that choked the air, but the kind that let things settle. A few hours later, Dylan had gone out to the shed behind the house to check on the tools. Gina stayed inside, wandering quietly through the living room. She wasn't snooping, just observing. A photograph caught her eye again, the little girl with the gap-toothed grin holding a jar of fireflies. She was maybe 6, maybe 7, full of mischief and joy. Gina blinked, caught off guard by the sudden ache in her chest. That kind of smile didn't come easy to people like her. Not anymore. She heard the truck before she saw it, gravel crunching beneath wheels, a sharp engine whine. Then the door swung open with a burst of cold air and boots stomping on the rug. A voice, light and cheerful, rang through the house. "Daddy, I found your gloves in my backpack, and I brought the milk like you said." Gina froze. The girl rounded the corner before Dylan could say anything. She was smaller than Gina expected, wearing a puffy red coat with a unicorn patch sewn onto the chest, a pink scarf wrapped 3 times around her neck, curls poking out from under a knit hat. Her face lit up when she saw Gina, eyes wide and curious. "Hi," she said without hesitation. "Are you the guest?" Gina glanced toward Dylan, who had just stepped in behind her, snow still clinging to his jacket. He didn't say a word. He let Gina answer for herself. "I guess," she said finally. The girl took off her hat, shook out her curls, and stepped closer. "I'm Abby. I'm 7. Do you like peanut butter?" Gina blinked. "Yeah, sure. Then we can be friends." Dylan cleared his throat softly. "Abby, remember what we talked about. Kindness first. No questions she doesn't want to answer." Abby looked up at him, serious. "I didn't ask anything bad, just about peanut butter." He smiled a little, ruffled her hair, and looked back at Gina. "She's curious and honest." Gina didn't smile, but her shoulders eased slightly. Later that afternoon, Abby dragged out a box of markers and paper and started drawing at the coffee table, while Gina sat nearby, folding the blanket she'd slept with. Abby held up a sketch, 3 stick figures holding hands under a crooked sun. "This is me and Daddy and you," she said matter-of-factly. Gina stared at the page. One figure had brown skin and a purple dress. "Is that me?" "Yeah. You don't have to wear purple. I just like it." Dylan watched the moment from the kitchen doorway. He didn't interrupt. He just leaned against the frame, arms crossed, and watched his daughter open a door that no adult ever seemed brave enough to walk through. At dinner, Gina helped set the table. She didn't have to. Dylan hadn't asked. She just did. There were only 3 plates mismatched. One chipped, one plain one with a cartoon moose on it. Abby insisted on using the moose. One said it made the food taste better. Gina served herself last and ate slowly like she wasn't sure if she was allowed to finish everything on her plate. Abby told stories about her friend Bella, who had lost a tooth and tried to trade it for a toy instead of putting it under the pillow, and about her school bus driver, who always sang Elvis songs off-key. Gina listened, not politely, genuinely, like she hadn't heard a child talk freely in a long time. When dinner ended, Abby ran to her room to find a book to read before bed. Dylan started clearing the dishes. Gina stood too. "You don't have to," he said. "I know," she answered, and kept clearing anyway. That night, long after the house went quiet, Gina stepped out onto the porch wrapped in the same quilt from the night before. The sky above was clear stars, sharp and cold against the black. She didn't know what time it was. Didn't care. She sat on the top step, pulling the fabric tighter around her shoulders. The door opened behind her. Dylan stood in the doorway holding a mug. "This porch gets real cold at night," he said softly. "I know." He held the mug out. "Warm milk. She swears by it." Gina took it, felt the heat seep into her hands. She didn't say thank you. But she didn't need to. Dylan stood there for a few seconds longer, then stepped back inside, closing the door without a sound. She took a slow sip and looked up at the stars again. No one had asked anything of her. No one had tried to take anything. No one had touched her. And yet, somehow, she was still here. And for the first time in a long time, she didn't want to run. Not yet. The snow had eased by morning, settling like a quiet layer of dust over the yard, softening the edges of the world. Inside the cabin, warmth hummed low from the stove, and the smell of oatmeal lingered in the air. Gina stood by the window, one hand resting lightly on the frame, her eyes tracing the shapes of pine trees and the tire tracks that curved out of the driveway and down the gravel road. She wasn't sure what exactly had stirred her awake that morning, but something had settled differently in her chest, like a warning too quiet to name. The day before had been simple, too simple. Kindness had come in small, manageable pieces like Abby's drawings, Dylan's silence, a warm cup of milk. But now there was a shift she couldn't explain, as if the trees themselves had started watching again and the stillness had taken on a different shape. She decided to take the trash out. It wasn't much, just a small bag from the kitchen bin, but it gave her a reason to step outside, to feel the air on her face, to remind herself that she could move freely if she wanted to. Dylan was in the shed, hammering something back into place, and Abby had already left for school. Gina pulled on the old boots Dylan had left by the door and stepped onto the porch, her breath forming soft clouds in the cold. The trash bins were set near the road beside the mailbox. As she walked, she heard a car approaching a slow roll of tires against packed snow. She didn't turn her head, but she felt it. The slowing. The pause. The vehicle, a pale blue sedan, eased up beside the mailbox. Behind the wheel, a woman in her 50s, well-dressed in a clean wool coat and dark gloves, stared straight ahead. But her eyes flicked toward Gina. Not a glance, not a curiosity, a stare, cold, unblinking. The kind of look that measured a person and made a silent decision about them without needing to ask a single question. Gina kept walking, her posture calm, but her hands tightened on the trash bag. The woman didn't wave, didn't nod, just drove off after a long, silent second. By the time Gina reached the house again, her heart was beating harder than it should have been. She placed the boots neatly by the door and sat on the edge of the couch, staring at the flickering stove. That woman hadn't said a word, but she had said everything. Gina had seen that look too many times, and it never meant anything good. Later that day, Dylan headed into town to grab a few things, milk bread, Abby's favorite granola bars, and Gina asked if she could stay behind. She said she wanted to clean up a bit. Dylan didn't question it. He just nodded, told her he wouldn't be long, and reminded her the back door, sometimes stuck in the cold. When he walked into the feed store on Main Street, the bell above the door jingled and 3 heads turned. It wasn't unusual. He was a familiar face, but there was something different in the way people paused now, like they expected him to speak first. Behind the counter, Carla Brinks leaned over the register and gave him a tight smile. "Heard you've got company out there," she said, voice casual but clipped. Dylan reached for a half-gallon of milk. Someone needed a place to stay. "She from around here?" Carla asked, tapping a receipt pad. "No," Dylan replied, "but that's not a problem, is it?" Carla shrugged. "Folks are just curious. That's all. She doesn't talk much, huh?" Dylan didn't answer that. He placed a few more items on the counter, pulled out his wallet. Carla bagged them without speaking further, but the air between them had shifted. He could feel it. The kind of tension that didn't raise its voice just lingered behind every word. Back at the cabin, a note had been left on the porch. No envelope, no signature, just a folded piece of paper weighed down with a small stone. Dylan spotted it as he walked up and immediately knew it wasn't anything good. He picked it up, unfolded it slowly. The handwriting was rushed and thick, written in black ink that had bled slightly from the cold. "You don't know who you're dealing with. She doesn't belong here. Neither do you if you keep her." He stood still for a long minute, the paper held tight in one hand. Then he folded it again, slipped it into his jacket pocket, and went inside without saying a word. That evening, after Abby had gone to her room to finish homework, and the house had quieted down, Gina noticed Dylan kneeling by one of the front windows, tightening the frame with a screwdriver. He was quiet, focused, jaw set. She watched from across the room, sensing something behind the silence. "Did something happen?" she asked finally. He didn't look at her right away. "Just fixing this window," he said. "It's always been drafty." Gina nodded slowly but said nothing. She didn't need to ask again. The way he worked, the way he kept glancing toward the driveway between turns of the screwdriver, it told her enough. Someone had said something. Someone had reminded him and her that not everyone wanted her here. At bedtime, as Gina passed by Abby's door, she heard the little girl's voice call out. Gina, she paused. Yeah, Abby sat up in bed, her blanket pulled to her chin. At school, one of the boys said, "Daddy bought you." Like, with money. That's not true, right? Gina froze. The words were soft, curious, not cruel. But they hit hard. She stepped into the room, slowly sat at the edge of the bed, and searched for the right thing to say. Before she could speak, Dylan appeared in the doorway. He looked between the two of them and came forward. People say things they don't understand, he said calmly. They repeat what they hear, even if it's wrong. But Abby, listen to me. No one buys people, not in this house. Gina is here because she belongs here, not because of anything someone else said. Abby nodded, trusting. Okay. She looked at Gina. I like that you're here. Gina didn't speak for a long moment. Then she smiled, small but real. I like being here. After Abby drifted off to sleep, Gina stepped onto the porch again. The cold bit at her skin, but she didn't care. She needed the air. Dylan joined her a few minutes later, hands in his coat pockets. She shouldn't have to deal with that, Gina said, her voice low. She's stronger than people think, Dylan replied. I know what those kids heard, Gina said. I've heard it my whole life. Maybe not the exact words, but the tone, the looks. Dylan didn't argue. He didn't offer platitudes. He just stood there beside her, steady and quiet. You regret bringing me here, she asked after a beat. No, he said without hesitation, but I hate that this place is making you feel like you don't belong. She glanced at him, her eyes tired but sharp. They don't even know me. They don't want to. Then why try? He turned, meeting her gaze. Because we don't fix anything by backing down. We fix it by standing our ground. She looked away, out into the dark trees. Standing gets you shot where I'm from. Dylan nodded slowly. Maybe. But running never got you safe either. She didn't respond. Not right away. But when they both went back inside, she closed the door behind her like she meant it. The next few days passed with a quiet rhythm that Gina hadn't known in years. Not the kind of silence that meant someone was watching or waiting to strike, but the kind that let the body slow down without threat. She woke early each morning before the sun had fully risen over the pines and moved through the cabin in her own small way. Dylan never asked her to do anything, but she started doing things anyway. She wiped down the counters in the kitchen, swept near the entryway where melted snow left muddy tracks, and carefully organized the loose papers stacked on the dining table. It wasn't about earning her keep. She just needed to feel useful. For someone like her, still halfway between fight and flight, usefulness felt like a form of safety. Boomer Dylan's old golden retriever had taken to following her around the house like a quiet, oversized shadow. He didn't beg or bark, just laid his head on her feet whenever she stood still too long. One morning, as she fed him the last of the dry kibble from the bin, Dylan walked in from the porch, tugging off his gloves. He paused in the doorway, watching for a beat before speaking. He's a good judge of character, he said, nodding toward the dog. Gina didn't look up right away. She finished pouring the food, set the scoop down, and only then replied, He's probably just hungry. Dylan gave a slight shrug, not pushing it. Still, took him 3 weeks to warm up to our old mailman. That made her smile just a little, and he noticed, but he didn't comment. Later that afternoon, while looking for a towel in the laundry room, Gina opened a plastic bin on the floor marked giveaway. Inside, folded carefully, were old sweatshirts, a pair of flannel pajamas, and a dark green winter coat with a broken zipper. She hesitated, touched the coat with her fingertips, then picked up a thick knit sweater, navy blue, with a loose collar and sleeves just a little too long. It smelled faintly of cedar and something else she couldn't quite name. She pulled it over her shirt. It fit in that imperfect way that made it feel real. When she stepped back into the hallway, Abby spotted her immediately and lit up. That was my mom's, she said, pointing. You look good in it. Gina froze. I didn't mean to take it. Abby shook her head. She wouldn't mind. She always said clothes are for keeping people warm, not keeping them folded. From the kitchen, Dylan glanced over. He didn't say anything, but his eyes lingered for an extra second. Not judgmental, just watching like he was registering how the sweater didn't just fit her. It suited her. That night, while Abby colored at the coffee table, Gina sat beside her folding laundry. The radio played low from the corner, just static and soft country chords. At one point, Abby looked up and asked, Did you go to school when you were my age? Gina paused, a towel still in her lap. No, not really. Abby furrowed her brow. Why not? Didn't black girls get to go to school? Dylan looked up from where he was reading, startled, but didn't interrupt. Gina's voice stayed calm. Most do. I didn't. I was raised somewhere that told me I wasn't smart enough, or didn't need to learn. Abby frowned, clearly not liking that answer. That's dumb. Gina smiled a little more this time. Yeah, it is. The conversation ended there, not because anyone wanted to avoid it, but because the truth had landed where it needed to. And for Abby, that was enough for now. That night, after Abby was asleep, Dylan stood by the stove adjusting the damper while Gina rinsed a mug in the sink. The fire crackled behind them, casting slow, warm shadows on the wood-paneled walls. The quiet between them wasn't awkward. It had grown familiar, comfortable. I saw the bin in the laundry room, Gina said. Take whatever you want from it, Dylan replied. It's just stuff no one uses anymore. She nodded, dried her hands with a dish towel. The sweater. It's warm. She'd like that, it's being used, he said, voice soft. Gina looked at him, eyes holding something heavier. You talk about her like she's still part of this place. She is. Dylan answered, not in a ghost way, just in the way things were built. Gina didn't ask more. But that night, when she sat on the porch again, wrapped in the same quilt, she realized she hadn't thought about running all day. The next evening, after Abby had gone to bed early with a slight fever, Dylan and Gina found themselves in the living room again, seated across from each other with the fire burning low. Dylan sipped tea from a chipped mug, his other hand resting on the back of his neck, like something was weighing on him. Gina noticed. She always noticed. You okay? She asked. He nodded, then shook his head, then finally answered. You ever want something but not know how to reach for it without making it worse? She considered that. Yeah, all the time. He met her eyes then, and for the first time neither of them looked away. There was something unspoken between them, not new, but finally acknowledged. The warmth in the room was real, but so was the space between them, charged and fragile. I think about what it would mean if people saw us. Closer than we are now, he said carefully. What that would bring down on you. On Abby. On us. Gina didn't move. You think I don't think about that too? He sat forward, elbows on his knees. It's not about shame. It's not about you. It's just this place, this town they don't forget. They don't forgive. And they damn sure don't understand. She leaned back, crossing her arms. So what are you saying? That it's better to pretend nothing's happening? I'm saying I don't want to be the reason you get hurt again. That hit deeper than he probably meant it to. Gina looked away, her jaw tightening. I've been hurt for years, Dylan, by people who pretended to care. You're the first one who didn't ask me to prove I'm worth helping. Silence filled the space again, but this time it wasn't gentle. He swallowed hard. Then maybe I'm scared of what it means to care back. Her voice came quiet but steady. Then say that. Don't hide behind the town. They didn't speak more that night. Both retreated to their corners, not angry, just uncertain. Two people caring too much, afraid to drop anything in case it all shattered. But when Dylan turned off the last lamp before heading to his room, he glanced toward the couch where Gina was already lying down, eyes closed but breathing unevenly. And he whispered, not loud enough for her to hear, I see you. Even when I'm quiet, I see you. And upstairs, when he lay down in bed, he found sleep didn't come easy. Because caring wasn't the hard part. Letting himself feel it, that was. The wind picked up before dawn hard, inviting, carrying with it a low whistle that pressed through the cracks in the cabin walls. Gina was already awake, sitting near the stove, staring at the red embers inside, as if waiting for them to speak. Something about the quiet didn't sit right. Dylan had left early to help clear the county road near Miller's Creek. He'd kissed Abby on the forehead before stepping into the cold, told Gina he wouldn't be long, and promised to pick up salt for the steps on the way home. That was hours ago. Now the sky outside had shifted to a strange color, thick, dull, and full of weight. Gina rose slowly, crossed the room, and opened the front door. The wind slapped her face. Snow wasn't falling lightly anymore. It came sideways now like needles. By mid-morning, Abby sat curled up with Boomer on the couch, watching cartoons on low volume while Gina reheated leftover soup. There had been no word from Dylan, no call, no sound of the truck, just wind. Gina tried not to stare at the driveway every few minutes. She tried not to check the clock again. Then the knock came. 3 fast raps, sharp and desperate. Boomer barked once. Gina opened the door to find Tom Fletcher, the town's mailman and volunteer firefighter, his beard caked in frost, eyes wide with urgency. "It's Dylan," he said before she could speak. "A tree came down. I found him near the bend at Carter's Bluff. He's pinned, still breathing, but he's cold, Gina. Real cold." Gina's breath caught. "Where is he now? I couldn't move the tree. I tried. Couldn't risk doing more damage. I came straight here. The truck can't get up there in this storm." She didn't wait for the rest. "Can you stay with Abby?" Tom blinked, startled. "You can't go out in that, not alone. It's suicide." Gina had already grabbed her boots and coat. Her voice didn't rise. "You said he's still breathing. That means he has a chance. I'm going. Please watch her." Tom hesitated, then nodded once. "I'll keep her safe." Gina stepped out into the white. The wind howled like it was angry at her decision, but she moved forward without pause, each step carving a path through snow nearly up to her knees. Visibility dropped fast. The flashlight she carried barely pushed through the storm, but she kept walking, heart-pounding, steady eyes, sharp for landmarks. Dylan had shown her the trail, once pointed out the curve near the old bluff where the road split. Her boots slipped on the ice, but she didn't stop. Not when her fingers went numb. Not when her lungs started to burn. Not even when she thought about the last time she ran through snow, only that time no one was waiting at the other end. It took her almost 40 minutes to reach him. The shape of the truck came first, half buried a broken branch leaning across the hood. Then she saw him. Dylan lay on the ground behind the passenger side, one leg trapped under a thick trunk of pine. His face was pale lips tinged blue, and his breath came in quick, shallow pulls. "Dylan," she called, rushing to his side. He stirred weakly, eyes blinking against the wind. "Gina." "I'm here," she said, crouching down. Her hands moved fast, brushing snow from his chest, checking his pulse. "Still there. I'm going to get you out. Just hang on." "You shouldn't be here," he whispered. "It's too cold." "Then don't make me talk," she muttered, already looking for leverage. The tree was too heavy to lift directly. She scanned the edge of the road, found a thick branch, old but sturdy. She wedged it under the trunk, braced her weight against it, and pushed. The first time it didn't budge. The second time it groaned. The third time she screamed through her teeth and felt the trunk shift just enough. Dylan cried out, his leg dragging free with a thud. She dropped to her knees, breathing hard. Okay, you're out." He winced, eyes squeezing shut. "Hurts, I know. But you're alive." She pulled an emergency blanket from her coat pocket, wrapped it around his torso, then slid in beside him, using her own body heat to keep him from slipping further. The wind roared and snow continued to fall, but she didn't flinch. "They told me no one would ever come," she whispered into the silence. "They said if I ran, I'd die out here alone, that people like me weren't meant to be saved." Dylan's voice was barely audible. They were wrong. Gina swallowed hard. "You're the first person who looked at me like I was human." He turned his face toward her. "Then you never looked in a mirror." They stayed like that, huddled in snow, heartbeat to heartbeat. She held on to him, not because he asked, but because she couldn't let go. Time blurred. Eventually, distant voices pierced the storm. Flashlights, footsteps, Tom calling her name. They found them curled together under the tree line. Dylan half-conscious, Gina alert but shaking. She helped them lift him onto a sled, refused help herself until she knew he was secure. Back at the cabin, Abby ran to the door when she saw them return. Gina knelt beside her, wrapped her arms tight, and didn't say a word. She didn't need to. That night, while Dylan was treated at the clinic and Abby slept curled beside Boomer, Gina stood alone by the window, hands trembling. Not from cold, but from everything she'd held in. She had survived. Again. But this time, she hadn't done it alone. And for the first time in her life, she wasn't the one being saved. She was the one who saved. The clinic room smelled faintly of antiseptic and coffee, a strange mix that Gina had come to associate with places where pain was expected, but not necessarily addressed. Dylan lay on the narrow bed, his leg elevated and wrapped tight color slowly returning to his cheeks. The doctor had said he'd be okay, bruised, but lucky a few inches either way, and they might have been looking at something much worse. Gina sat beside him. Not because anyone asked her to, but because that's where she belonged. Her jacket still carried the scent of smoke and snow, and her hands were dry from wind and cold, but she didn't notice. Her focus was on the steady rise and fall of Dylan's chest, on the quiet rhythm that meant he was still here. When he stirred, it was slow. His voice, when it came, was rough. "You stayed." Gina didn't look away. "You thought I wouldn't." He let out a weak laugh, then winced. "Remind me not to laugh for a while." She reached for the cup of water on the side table and helped him drink. "You scared her, Abby. She didn't say much when I got back, but she didn't leave the window all night." He looked down. "I didn't mean to." "I know, but she knows who pulled you out." Gina leaned back in the chair, arms crossed, eyes steady. "So do a lot of people." Dylan nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "You shouldn't have come for me. Not in that storm." Gina's voice stayed even. "Don't say that. Don't make me regret doing what I did." He looked at her, then really looked. "I don't. Not for a second." Back at the cabin 2 days later, things moved slower. The storm had passed, but left behind a layer of frost so thick it glittered like glass on every surface. Dylan rested on the couch with his leg propped up, Boomer curled nearby. Abby had returned to her usual chatter, but her tone had softened, like she understood, now that things could be taken away without warning. Gina cooked simple meals, cleaned without being asked, and moved through the house like someone who had always been there. But something had shifted, not in how she acted and how she was seen. One afternoon, while Dylan dozed, Abby stood at the kitchen table with markers scattered everywhere. Gina washed dishes at the sink, half listening as the little girl hummed to herself. Then Abby held up a drawing, triumphant. "This is you," she said, pulling Daddy out of the snow like a superhero. Gina turned, drying her hands on a towel. The picture was crude but unmistakable. A girl with brown skin and a purple scarf dragging a stick figure from a white storm cloud. "That's very dramatic," Gina said, a smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. Abby nodded, because it was. "Daddy was all blue, and you were all brave. Miss Stevens said brave means doing something, even if you're scared." Gina took the picture, studied it for a moment, then placed it gently on the refrigerator door, securing it with a faded magnet shaped like a cow. That evening, someone knocked at the door. Gina tensed instinctively, wiping her hands on her jeans. Dylan called from the couch, "Can you get it?" She opened the door slowly. On the porch stood Mirabelle Stevens, wrapped in a thick coat, holding a foil-covered dish. Her face was firm, but not unkind. "Chicken and rice," Mirabelle said. "You all need warm food." Gina stepped aside. "Thank you." Mirabelle didn't move. "You saved him." "I didn't do it for a thank you." "I know. That's what makes it real." Mirabelle hesitated. "I judged you too quick. People talk. But what you did, it shut most of them right up." Gina looked her in the eye. "People talk because they're bored or scared. I don't live for their opinions." Mirabelle gave a small nod. "Good. Neither do I." She handed over the dish and turned to go, then paused. "You ever need a ride to town, you let me know. Not everyone's against you." Gina watched her walk back to her car, the snow crunching underfoot. She closed the door, carried the dish to the kitchen, and said nothing. Dylan looked up as she returned. "Was that Mirabelle?" Gina nodded. "She brought food, said people stop talking." Dylan raised an eyebrow. "That fast, not fast, just loud enough that they had to listen." The next day, while Dylan napped, Gina wandered into the back of the cabin. The old storage shed had always been there, but today the door was cracked open. Inside, someone had cleared space, swept the floor, placed a small table near the window. A stack of blank paper, a coffee mug full of pencils, and a folded flannel blanket sat in the corner. She didn't ask. She knew who had done it. She stepped inside, touched the table, then ran her fingers along the window frame. The glass was clean. The space smelled of cedar and faintly of turpentine. A place to think. A place to breathe. That night she cooked dinner without asking if anyone was hungry. She hummed as she stirred the soup, low and off-key, but real. Abby walked in, nose twitching. "You're singing." Gina turned. "Not really. Do it more." "I like it." Gina smiled, but didn't answer. Dylan came in, moved slower than usual, but steadier, and sat at the table. He looked at her for a long moment. "You found the room." She nodded. "Thank you." He shrugged. "You needed space. Not everything has to be said out loud." She brought over the soup, set it down, and sat across from him. The fire crackled in the stove. Abby climbed into her chair and started talking about school again. Gina listened, really listened, and for the first time in her life, she didn't feel like she was intruding. Later that evening, when the dishes were done and the house was quiet, Gina stood on the porch alone. The stars were out clear and bright, the snow reflecting just enough moonlight to make the trees glow. Dylan joined her, leaning on the railing. "Feels different now," he said. She didn't look at him. "I used to think quiet meant danger, that if no one was yelling, something worse was coming." And now she exhaled slowly. Now it just feels quiet. He didn't reply. He didn't need to. They stood together in that silence, not to fill it, but to share it. The wind had settled. The town had calmed. And for the first time, Gina didn't feel like she was waiting for it all to fall apart again. She was just there. Present. Home, maybe. Not because someone said so, but because she chose it. And that choice changed everything. The knock came just after breakfast when the dishes were still warm in the sink, and Abby was upstairs brushing her hair. Gina opened the door without thinking and immediately regretted it. The man on the porch stood tall, dressed too neatly for someone local, with boots that hadn't touched mud and a stare that didn't blink. Beside him, the woman exhaled cigarette smoke like it was the only thing keeping her upright. Her eyes landed on Gina with a mix of boredom and something colder ownership. "Hi, sweetheart," the woman said, smiling without warmth. Gina didn't answer. Her throat tightened, not from fear, but from the weight of old conditioning pressing against her spine. The man took a step forward. "We're here for our daughter." Before Gina could respond, Dylan appeared behind her, voice firm and low. "I think you should leave." The man didn't even look at him. "We're her legal guardians. She's underage. You've been harboring her." "She's 19, Dylan said. "And free." The woman scoffed. "She has no papers, no ID, no birth certificate, and we've got statements. People saw you hand over cash. That's trafficking, friend. We can make this real messy." Gina still hadn't moved. Her hands were curled into fists inside her sleeves. Dylan stepped fully onto the porch. "You don't speak for her anymore. You gave up that right the day you sold her like cattle. You don't want a legal fight," the man said. "People like you don't win those." Dylan stepped closer, his voice like gravel. "People like me. You mean the ones who protect the people you tried to destroy?" The man smiled, a thin, hateful thing. "You'll hear from our lawyer." "Then I'll get one of my own," Dylan said without hesitation. When they finally left, Gina stood in the doorway, frozen. Not from fear, from fury. Not because they had power, because they had dared to come back, like they hadn't done anything wrong. Dylan turned to her. "We'll fight it," he said quietly. She looked at him. "You sure you want to? This won't be clean. They'll dig. They'll lie." "I know," he said. "And I'm still here." That afternoon, Dylan made a call to someone he hadn't spoken to in years. Her name was Lily Young, a family attorney with a reputation for being tenacious and painfully precise. They had grown up together, lost touch, then reconnected once during a forest fire Dylan helped with. She owed him a favor, and he knew she was the only one he could trust with this. Lily arrived 2 days later, stepping out of a dusty black SUV in a sharp wool coat, her blonde hair pulled back, no-nonsense glasses perched on her nose. She looked at Gina, then at Dylan, then back at Gina. "I'm Lily Young," she said, extending a hand. "I heard you have people trying to take back what they already gave away." Gina shook her hand steady. "They never gave anything. They just kept me." Lily nodded once. "Then let's make sure they never get to keep anyone again." In the kitchen over coffee and case files, Lily asked the important questions. "No birth certificate, none that I ever saw," Gina answered. "School records, hospital visits, anything official." Gina shook her head. "They told people I was homeschooled, off the grid. It was about control, not care." Lily made a few notes. "They have no documentation. That means they have no legal claim. What we need is proof of who you are now." "What does that mean?" Dylan asked. "Character witnesses, statements, and if possible, proof they abandoned her long before this." Gina sat back, eyes tired. What if it's not enough? Lily looked at her squarely. "Then we make it enough." The hearing was scheduled 1 week later. A small county courthouse 2 towns over. The kind of place where wood paneling met fluorescent lighting, and the flag in the corner always looked a little too new. Gina sat outside the courtroom in a plain sweater and jeans, her hands folded in her lap, eyes fixed on the floor. Dylan sat beside her, saying nothing, but his presence was solid grounding. Abby was with Mirabelle that day, coloring pictures at the kitchen table kept safe from whatever might unfold. Inside, the opposing lawyer spoke first, reading from a typed sheet about guardianship, youth at risk, and moral obligation. He painted a picture of Dylan as a man who took in a girl without paperwork, without consent, and kept her from her rightful family. The couple, if you could call them that, sat with smug silence, never once looking at Gina. Then it was Lily's turn. She stood calm and clear. "This is not a custody hearing. This is not about the return of a daughter to grieving parents. This is about a young woman who was stripped of her identity, denied education, isolated from the world, and treated as less than human by the very people claiming to care for her. Gina was called to the stand. She stood, walked forward, and sat tall. Her voice didn't shake. I didn't grow up with a name that was mine. I didn't get birthday parties or report cards. I got chores and threats. I got silence when I asked for more. And the first time I saw the inside of a real house with warmth, it was Dylan's. He didn't ask me what I could give. He asked if I wanted something to eat. He didn't look at me like a problem. He looked at me like a person. She paused, eyes scanning the room. They say he bought me, like I'm an object. But the truth is, I've never been more free than I was that day. And I didn't run from them. I walked toward something better, toward someone who didn't see me as broken. A quiet fell over the room. The judge, a woman with silver hair and glasses that rested low on her nose, didn't speak for a moment. Then came the statements. Tom Fletcher in his uniform spoke plainly. She saved Dylan's life in the middle of a snowstorm, alone, with nothing but her own 2 hands. That's not someone who needs rescuing. That's someone we need more of. Mirabelle stood next. I misjudged her. I was wrong. I saw someone who didn't fit, but now I see someone who belongs. She has dignity. More than I had standing in judgment. Finally, Lily handed a drawing to the court clerk. It was a child's sketch, 3 stick figures holding hands standing in front of a house with crooked windows and smoke curling from the chimney. A dog, a swing, a sun. This was drawn by Abby Scott. Lily said, age 7. Her only note, this is me, Daddy, and Gina. We're a family. The judge took a deep breath, looked at Gina, then at the couple, then back to the paper in front of her. The court finds no valid guardianship, no legal documentation, and no compelling evidence that these individuals provided care consistent with parental responsibility. Gina Mitchell is of legal age, capable of self-determination, and by this court's ruling, free from any claim of custody or restraint. Gina didn't react at first. She just stared ahead, as if waiting for the moment to shatter. Dylan stood slowly, reached for her hand. She didn't take it. She stood turned and wrapped her arms around him, instead, holding on like something permanent. Lily smiled as she packed up her papers. That's what winning feels like, she said softly. And for the first time in her life, Gina believed it. There was a strange stillness the morning after the court ruling, like the world itself had paused to let Gina breathe. She stood by the front window of the cabin, a mug of coffee in her hands, watching frost melt off the porch railing while the sun warmed the hills in quiet streaks. Dylan was outside checking the propane tank and patching the shed door where the wind had pulled it loose last week. Inside, Abby sang off-key from the kitchen, trying to spread peanut butter on 2 thick toast. Life had slipped into something almost soft. Almost. But peace has a way of testing its own strength. 3 days later, the wind shifted. Dylan noticed it first sniffing the air with that instinct people who live near pine forests tend to have. He looked west toward the ridgeline above Miller's Creek, where a thin column of smoke was climbing skyward, slow at first, then darker. Gina, he called through the screen door, his voice calm but urgent. Grab the emergency radio. She stepped outside, eyes narrowing. That smoke. It's too close. He nodded. Fire jump. Probably started miles off. This wind'll carry it faster than we want. By early afternoon, the emergency broadcast confirmed it brush fire accelerated by dry grass and high gusts heading straight for the southern stretch of Marlow Ridge. Evacuation orders went out for the outer properties. Dylan was already pulling out the go bags he kept in the hall closet. He handed one to Gina and knelt in front of Abby. You remember the planned church basement with the others. Miss Stevens will be there. Abby nodded solemnly. I already packed my stuff bare. Dylan smiled, kissed her forehead. Then he looked at Gina. You go with her. I'll stay long enough to wet down the roof, maybe reinforce the back fence. Gina didn't move. I'm staying. Gina, you said this was my home now. That makes it my fight too. I know this ridge, Dylan. I know the trails better than half the people coming up from town. I can help. He didn't like it. She could see it in the way his jaw tightened, the way his eyes flicked toward the smoke and back to her face. But he didn't argue again. He just handed her the second radio. By late afternoon, the sky had gone orange. The town's volunteer fire crew and neighbors with water tanks on their trucks worked like ants, cutting fire lines, soaking brush, and marking escape paths. Gina fell into rhythm, fast barking instructions, calling out terrain changes. No one questioned her this time. Not after what she'd already done for Dylan. Someone grumbled, "Who put her in charge?" but it was quickly answered by Tom, who was hauling hoses from the church truck, the one who saved him. Twice. By sunset, the fire crept close to the edge of Dylan's property. They had done all they could with water, so Gina grabbed a shovel and began digging a fire break behind the shed. Sweat poured down her back, her hands blistering inside borrowed gloves. Boomer barked wildly near the tree line. Something was wrong. She turned and saw him darting toward the rear fencing, where flames were now licking the dry grass near the old woodpile. "Boomer," she yelled, but he didn't stop. She dropped the shovel and ran after him, heart pounding. The smoke was thicker here, stinging her eyes. She found him near the back of the shed, trapped between collapsed boards and a burning tree limb. He was whimpering, nose pressed to the dirt. "I got you," she whispered, sliding under the half-collapsed fence line. She wrapped her arms around his neck and tugged hard once, twice, until the beam gave and the dog scrambled free. That's when she heard it, a sharp hiss behind her, the propane tank near the shed letting off pressure. Her blood ran cold. Gina Dillon's voice. "Get out of there." She turned. He was limping across the yard, favoring his still healing leg, waving her toward him. The hiss grew louder. Then came the pop, then the shockwave. The explosion wasn't large, but it was enough. Enough to knock her off her feet, enough to send Dillon sprawling. When she opened her eyes, the sky was full of ash. Boomer barked somewhere to her left. Dillon was beside her, groaning, blood trickling from a cut above his eyebrow. He pulled her into a sitting position, his hands shaking. "You okay?" She nodded, slowly coughing. "You came back. You think I'd let you do something reckless without me?" She laughed, a broken sound, then winced. "We almost got cooked." He looked at her eyes, glassy but locked in. "Gina, there's something I need to say." She froze. Not out of fear, out of knowing. "I regret a lot of things, but not this. Not you. Not even the damn tree that landed on me. The only thing I regret is not telling you sooner." She looked at him, lips parted slightly. "Telling me what? That I love you. That I look at you and it doesn't feel like something new. It feels like something I lost and just got back. And if we make it out of this in one piece, I'm not going to waste another minute pretending I don't feel it." She stared at him for a second longer, then leaned in. "Then don't wait." She kissed him. Not soft, not dramatic, just real. Dirt-smudged faces, ash-covered coats, arms wrapped around something solid in a world that kept shifting. Sirens wailed in the distance. Backup had arrived. Someone called their names. But for a few more seconds, they stayed right there, holding on. By the time the fire crews reached them, the worst had passed. The house was scorched, but standing. The shed was lost. The sky was dark, but the stars were starting to blink through. Dillon and Gina rode back to the church hall in the back of a truck, wrapped in blankets that smelled like smoke and wool. Abby saw them first and ran, nearly toppling over her own feet. "Daddy Gina." She hugged both of them so hard it made Dillon wince. He held her tight anyway. Gina pressed her forehead to the top of Abby's curls. Later, as people gathered for hot soup and updates, whispers moved through the room. "They say she saved his dog. She went back for the shed. He ran after her like his life depended on it." One woman said softly, "Maybe it did." Mirabelle handed Gina a cup of tea. "You really like putting yourself in the fire, huh?" Gina exhaled slowly, looking across the room at Dillon, who sat with Abby, smiling in a way that reached all the way to his eyes. "Not anymore," she said. "Now I just go where I'm needed." The fire had burned most of the western ridge, but the Granger cabin was still there. So was Boomer. So was everything that mattered. Gina had once been sold like a secret. Now she was held like something worth protecting. And this time no one was going to take her away again. It took nearly 2 weeks for the smoke to stop clinging to the cabin walls, even longer for the smell of burned pine to loosen its grip on the furniture and quilts. Dillon patched the porch railing by hand, piece by piece, while Gina swept ash from the window frames and repainted the shed door they managed to save. Boomer followed them everywhere, limping slightly from a sprained paw, but never letting either of them out of his sight. The fire had scorched the hillside and left a charcoal stain across the land, but what mattered had survived, and something about that gave everyone in the house a new kind of patience. Gina stopped counting days. She started baking again, though she never used recipes. Abby returned to school with stories no one dared question and drawings pinned up on every bulletin board. People from town started coming by, not with questions or stares, but with casseroles wrapped in foil flowers in glass jars, notes that read, "Thank you" in slanted handwriting. They didn't ask anything of her. They just showed up quietly and left something warm behind. One Thursday morning, Gina walked into the kitchen to find Abby standing on a stool taping up a banner made from construction paper. The letters were uneven and sparkled with glitter glue. It read, "Happy U-Day, Gina." She froze for a moment, one hand still on the doorframe. Abby looked over her shoulder, grinning. "It's not your birthday," the girl said, "but I think you deserve one anyway. Daddy said the best days aren't always the ones you're born with." Gina blinked slowly, then smiled, her chest tightening in that quiet way it did when love arrived gently, without asking for permission. Dylan came in a few minutes later carrying a cake, not store-bought, but something he baked himself the night before. Lemon her favorite, even though she'd never told him that out loud. "I burned the first one," he said, setting it down. "Abby told me to try again." Gina looked between the two of them. "You planned this." Abby beamed. Not planned, just decided. The three of them ate cake for breakfast. No music, no gifts, just warm forks, sticky fingers, and laughter that reached up through the rafters. Later, they sat on the back steps, Gina wrapped in the same patched quilt Dylan had offered her that first night. He leaned close enough for her to feel the weight of his shoulder against hers. "You think it's crazy?" he asked. She glanced at him. "What is wanting to make this official? Us. Not for the law or the town or anything out there. Just for us." She didn't answer at first. She watched Abby chasing Boomer through the field, her laughter cutting across the soft wind. Then she turned back to Dylan. "Nothing about us has ever been about doing things the way other people do them. So, no, I don't think it's crazy. I think it's overdue." 2 days later, they stood barefoot in the grass behind the cabin under a sky that finally remembered how to be blue. Mirabelle Stevens stood with them, holding a folded napkin with their vows written in ink that had smudged slightly from being carried too long in a jacket pocket. Tom Fletcher brought a Bible and read one short passage about grace and fire. Abby wore a crown of daisies and declared herself both the flower girl and the ring bearer, though there were no rings. Dylan took Gina's hands in his and said, "You were never lost. You were just waiting to be seen." Gina replied, "You didn't save me. You made space for me to come back to myself. There were no guests, no photographer, no speeches." But when Abby clapped her hands sticky with frosting from the cupcakes Mirabelle brought, the whole hill seemed to echo. That night, as the sun slipped behind the trees and the lanterns on the porch flickered, Gina sat with Dylan and Abby around the fire pit. Abby roasted marshmallows and told stories that she made up as she went. Boomer dozed with his chin on Gina's boots. Dylan passed her a mug of tea, fingers brushing hers. "So what now?" Gina took a slow breath. "Now we live. We fix the door when it breaks. We fight about dishes. We figure it out." Dylan smiled. "That's all I ever wanted." Spring came quietly, the kind that didn't need permission. It arrived in the soft bloom of wildflowers across the slope, in the way the creek behind the cabin swelled just enough to carry song, in the way sunlight stayed a little longer each evening. Gina started waking up before the others, just to hear birdsong. She began sketching again. Dylan cleared a corner of the shed and built a small art table with reclaimed wood. He called it her spot to breathe. One morning, Abby walked into the kitchen holding a piece of cardboard. On it, 3 figures held hands in front of a lopsided house with a yellow sun and smoke curling from a chimney. At the top, in glitter glue, she had written, "The Miracle House." "Is that us?" Gina asked. Abby nodded. "And that's the dog. And those are marshmallows." Gina laughed, then cried, then laughed again. She pinned the drawing to the fridge right next to the picture Abby had drawn months earlier, the one of Gina pulling Dylan out of a snowstorm. Later that evening, after Abby had fallen asleep, surrounded by books and crumbs, Dylan and Gina stood on the porch. The air was warm. The world was still. "You ever think we'd make it here?" he asked. Gina looked out at the pines, then up at the stars. "I used to think I wasn't meant to make it anywhere. But now..." She turned to him, her voice quiet but sure. "Now I know this is where I was always meant to arrive." She stepped off the porch, walked into the yard barefoot, the grass still cool from evening dew. She looked back once, just long enough to see Dylan watching her with that soft smile he never used on anyone else. Then she closed her eyes and whispered, not to the wind, not to the stars, but to the girl she used to be. "You made it." And for once, the world didn't ask her to prove it.
Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.